pick up the phone, have no idea who's calling me at 3 in the morning. And I just get this heavily accented French voice. Can you hold on? I'm connecting you with the president.
Welcome. I am ARC Press Senior Editor DJ Butler. Welcome to the Gopherwood Lounge. Before we get started, let me remind you to like the video, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, share in social media. Come find us, our mailing list, and follow us for more videos like this. I'm excited today to be here for a conversation with a couple of people whose academic background is in national security, which is interesting, right? John, in a conversation just a few minutes ago, is using the phrase adventure academic, and was throwing out characters like Indiana Jones. And so my only expectation for this conversation is that it's going to be interesting. Let me introduce John really quick. John Payne, not the producer of Lord of the Rings, Rings of Power. He's the other John Payne, who I know because I've known him in writing circles for over a decade now. It feels like it's 12, maybe getting on 12 years. I'm not sure.
Something like that, yeah.
Something like that. A small publisher, game publisher, and a science fiction fantasy writer, but who did his.
I also run the DJ Butler fan Discord.
This is also
which has an ARC Press channel.
That is true. So if you got booted, anyone who's listening to this from the Discord, it wasn't me. It was probably John. So by chance. So but John's background is part of John's background is that he got a PhD in is it security studies? What was the name of the?
It was political science, and the two major fields were security studies and international relations.
Okay, at MIT. Now, while he was there, one of his associates was Mark Devore, and Mark, thrilled to have you on here. You have not yet taken the 90-degree turn into being a science fiction writer. Not yet, but I would say not yet because you know publishers and writers, and maybe after this call you'll have a moment where you say, I've got this idea. But tell me about security studies. So, okay, international relations, I feel like I know what that is. It's like Bretton Woods, GATT, diplomacy, that stuff. What is, it's the Trump administration's tariff trade wars, right? This is all very public conversation now. What's the other side? What does it mean to study, to have a PhD, to work in security studies, or to have national security as an academic job?
Well, I think if you draw a line from Thucydides to Machiavelli to Hans Morgenthau, that's kind of, just imagine that arrow continues. And
okay,
go ahead, Mark.
I was going to say, I think the core of security studies, and by the way, security studies have become a lot more important and apropos to our world than when I and John started studying them. But security studies are broadly asking the questions of, why does war occur? How do wars change the balance of power between states? And also, why and how does victory or defeat occur in wars? So it's sort of asking this big set of questions around war, which is relatively a gloomy science, but unfortunately, war has always been with us, and war likely always will be with us until we arrive in some sci-fi utopia.
Yeah. So that's interesting, right? Because I always risk saying something stupid because I'm an amateur at everything, Mark. But one of the immediate thoughts I have, right, is the nature of war on the planet. Right, we've lived through this really interesting period, right? We had these two massive world wars, and then I don't know if this is the right phrase for it, but something like a Pax Americana, and like going out on a limb, I think the threat of being hit by nukes maybe has helped keep conflict of that scale from happening, right? No one wants to get nuked. Um, so instead we have a different order of warfare, things that look more like police actions and guerrilla warfare and things like that. I that was a question in my head before I started. I don't know how it turned into a statement. Sorry. Tell me what your role has
I
been.
think the answer is yeah.
Yeah. Well, I guess my question is, so is that what you end up studying? Is figures like Che and Gaddafi and the Taliban?
Yeah, I would say that war and the future likelihood of war has been shifting over time. So I would have completely agreed with you, and I did completely agree with you circa 2010 or circa 2000 that we were in a Pax Americana where great power war was extremely unlikely.
Yeah.
And I think there's several reasons for that. I mean, one was the United States was established a certain world order. Including institutions like NATO, a series of treaty arrangements in Asia, financial
World Trade
institutions such as,
Organization, IMF,
yeah,
yeah,
and those were backed up by both the US's engagement in those institutions and the US's relative power, which was uncontested for an extremely long period of time, and certainly since between the fall of the Soviet Union and really the rise of China quite recently. So statistically, you're actually right that there were very few long wars between states.
No.
Since 1945, there have only been 3 interstate wars that could be described as a high intensity that lasted longer than 90 days.
That's interesting.
Korean War,
It's
yeah,
interesting that like right now we have something developing, India and Pakistan, to, nuclear armed states. I don't know if I would describe Pakistan as a great power, right? But we have 2 nuclear armed states actually engaged in direct conflict, which is something we have not really seen before, unless you count like the Kargil crisis and stuff like that.
yeah, I think that I'd probably even dial back a little bit earlier and say that Russia-Ukraine, in a way, is a landmark in the
Yeah,
sense that it involves one great power attacking another significant country. I mean, Ukraine is not necessarily a
right,
great power, but it is a country of 42 million inhabitants that is Europe's second largest country in terms of land
right,
mass, with the objective of basically turning it into a satellite or annexing large parts of it. And that's a war that
right.
now is over 3 years into it. So I think Russia-Ukraine in some ways is the longest high-intensity war between meaningful states, at least since the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s, and possibly since the Korean War. And then with India-Pakistan, we are getting something that might degenerate into a full-scale war between a great power, India, a significant nuclear-armed country, Pakistan, occurring simultaneously to Russia-Ukraine being ongoing.
Yeah,
So in some ways, we've had a number. One could also tie into this the conflict in the Middle East, including, which is not only Israel-Gaza, but I guess from a great power perspective, involved Iran,
Iran,
its proxies of
right.
Hezbollah and the Houthis in a prolonged confrontation with Israel and various states that supported it in various ways at different times. So in a way, we've ended up with multiple conflicts that individually would have stood out from the norm of international relations, all occurring nearly simultaneously. So I think that we're seeing a tipping of the international order into something that is more conflictual than we've
Mhm.
seen in the recent past.
I think that's super
Although, as
interesting.
Yogi Berra said, it's difficult to make predictions, especially about the future. Um, when Mark and I were just starting out, when we were just beginning our graduate program, we were talking about, like, is there a point to security studies anymore, right?
Yeah.
Because great power war is all done, and maybe we'll have to look for other things to study,
Sure,
and maybe even war itself is kind of withering
sure.
away. This was a conversation that lots of people were having at the time, and then
Francis Fukuyama,
after
the end
we
of
Yeah.
history.
yeah, sure, sure. And then we came back from our, first summers away, and we're talking about, all this stuff. And then, like, 2 days later, September 11th,
Yeah,
and that
yeah,
that changed some trajectories of some careers. I ended up,
yeah.
writing my dissertation about terrorism because of that. Mark and I taught a class
Yeah.
during interim activities period, the IAP, about terrorism, and also GI Joe comics.
Yeah. It's interesting. It feels to me, um, without wanting to get into discussions of domestic politics, but it feels to me like that one of the drivers maybe of this change is that for a long time, American perception is that for a long time we have been guaranteeing the international order, but like our end of the deal is not a good one because our end of the deal is, again, this is just perception, right? But I think this is on both the left and the right. Um, our sons go to war or they go out to these police actions and they come home, it's sometimes traumatized or dead, right? I don't I don't want to like dismiss the occupation of soldier. I'm pro the American soldier, right? Okay. Um, we all the manufacturing jobs, rightly or wrongly, the perception, is the economic side of this order is the blood side is we're guaranteeing the sea lanes and we're keeping all the wars down. It's our blood. The treasure side is we lose all the manufacturing jobs and all we get in return is cheap stuff. And cheap stuff sounds great, but if it's only cheap stuff, who it's great for is the people who never lost their jobs. And so, like, if you're sort of a white collar, an engineer, accountant, lawyer, right? Hey, it's all gravy, right? It feels like there's peace, prosperity. My purchasing power is really huge, but it feels like the American public is sort of done. Um, there's probably other reasons too, right? But it's interesting, and I would say probably frightening to contemplate that what that actually means is, um, to a greater extent than we have seen in any of our lifetimes, America might kind of say, listen, we can be Fortress America. We have our friends Canada and Mexico. We kind of have everything we need here. If you want to be our friend, be our friend. And if you don't, it's your problem, right? And those it's your problems might start to really multiply and get bigger and bigger if America is not involved.
Yes, Dave. No, I completely agree with your assessment that that's the direction of public perception in the United States towards the US's role in the world.
Yeah.
And
And I think we can say that it's not just a current administration thing. You can look back to the Obama administration, first Trump, Biden, and see there has been a retreating of America from the world stage. There's been,
Yeah. I don't think it's
um,
something or a
a
right
decrease
wing.
in our engagement.
Yeah.
Yeah.
and, and I think that this falls at exactly the wrong time in international relations because this trend is growing at the same time as revisionism by two other great powers, China and Russia, has been on the uptake at almost the same time as the United States' public is becoming soured on the US's role in the world.
Yeah.
Um, and, and I think that if we were to break apart the various elements of why you said the American public is souring, it's perfectly understandable. Yeah, the American public really came to accept a widened role in the world with the Korean War. Yeah. In both of the world wars, the American public decided that there was a need to confront a present evil or a present aggressor. The US mobilized from a relatively low base, absolutely enormous militaries, topping 10 million in World War II. And then in both cases,
Immediately downscaled.
immediately downscaled. Now, it was almost the relatively unique circumstances of the late 40s and 1950 that really led the US to take on the global role it did, in which, following World War II, you get another aggressor almost immediately, in the sense of our former wartime ally, Joseph Stalin, breaking promises and engagements with regard to Eastern Europe, overthrowing democratic government and installing puppet Soviet governments, testing nuclear weapons, to the point where the US reverses itself in 1949 in terms of signing the North Atlantic Treaty. But until the Korean War, the North Atlantic Treaty remained largely just a document of paper. The US had not committed serious resources to rearming Europe or permanently stationing large numbers of American troops abroad. But then in 1950, North Korea invades South Korea. And this alarms the American public that this is another version of what happened in the late 1930s. So the American public becomes willing to shoulder this responsibility. Now, it's, I guess, understandable that 75 years later, without having something as significant as a world war, or as significant as that combination of a world war followed by what looked like the entree to another world war, the American public has forgotten how bad things can be when we do disengage from the world.
Yeah.
And then one gets that conflated with various domestic and burden sharing arguments. I mean, some of the burden sharing arguments I don't disagree with. The US's allies a lot of the US's allies have not historically spent as much as the United States has on defense. Now, at this moment, that is less true. The Poles, the Baltic states are all heading up towards 5% of GDP on defense, whereas the US is at 3.4%. The Poles, the Finns, the Baltic states, and the South Koreans also have universal male conscription. So in a way, that's also a tax in kind, in the sense that every male has to spend a year or two out of their life with reserve obligations thereafter, and is paid much less than they could earn in the private sector for that amount of time. So oftentimes in the US, that's the extent of allies' shirking is exaggerated, but it's still real by some allies.
It must vary, right, from country to country.
And then I think that the manufacturing arguments are largely false. I mean, the United States, as well as other advanced industrial democracies, made a mistake in allowing China to join the WTO when it did, and then in not coming up with a response when China began to break, either formally or informally, with various of the WTO's norms and policies.
Sure.
But
intellectual property, for example.
But the US's economic growth rate has been greater than those of any other mature industrial economies. So the US economy as a whole has grown faster than the British, Japanese, South Korean, Taiwanese, German economies, but that growth has been less evenly distributed, and less was done in terms of policy decisions to try to bolster or support manufacturing or industries in regions that are less well off. So in a way, I think the US has, through its policies over the last 30 years, achieved an own goal in creating a large part of the population that rightly views itself as having been disadvantaged. But it did that through its own policies. And I think the experience of other mature industrial societies shows that it wasn't the only way that mature industrialization could have been handled.
Yeah. Now I did this to us because I meant to start out with sort of introduction type questions, and then like I started talking about things that are interesting to me instead. So sorry about that. Let me rewind a minute here, Mark.
Yeah.
How did you decide you wanted to be Indiana Jones of brush fire conflicts in the 21st century? What point in your childhood did you say I want to be that guy?
So probably I would blame my parents, because they were both historians. My father of military and Middle Eastern history, and my mother of early modern European history.
Like your dad's car, the license plate is Ogode, right?
Yep, Ogode, who was the second great Khan of the Mongol Empire. My mom's car's license plate was Louis XIV. And my father was also a reserve officer in the U.S. Army and intelligence, and spent time in the Pentagon. So I grew up with all sorts of interesting stories about international relations and clever and adventurous folk, Lawrence of Arabia. My father's PhD dissertation was on the British military consuls in Asia Minor, which was after the Congress of Berlin ending, resolved the 1878 Russo-Turkish War. The British got the right to basically send unofficial spies into the depths of the Ottoman Empire, which was fairly adventurous stuff at the time.
Yeah.
So I grew up with these stories, but also in a typical youthful rebellion, wanted to do nothing like what my parents did. So I guess, as opposed to being a historian, I became a political scientist focusing on conflict.
Yeah.
And as opposed to being in the military, I've just gone off to a lot of war zones and advised a lot of governments on military-like things.
Hi, I'm DJ Butler, senior editor of ARC Press. How would you like to win $10,000? I want to talk to you briefly about the ARC Prize. The ARC Prize is a novel writing contest in 2025. The first thing you need to know is that the theme of the contest is America 2076. That is, of course, the 300th birthday of America, measuring from the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Our plan is to publish the winner on July 4th, 2026, which is to say on the 250th birthday. So your winning novel on America's 250th birthday will be published talking about America at 300. Now, does that date 2076 mean that you have to write some kind of near-term science fiction novel? Absolutely not. You can interpret the theme America 2076 any way you want. Formally, we're launching the prize on March 8, 2025, which is, as we all know, all we writers and editors know, National Proofreading Day. And don't we appreciate those people? And the contest will run for 7 months, 7 full NaNoWriMos, to end on National Taco Day, which, as we all know, is October 7th, 2025. Now, let me tease you a little bit more. I said up front you could win $10,000. Actually, the prize is a publishing contract contract with Arc Press with a $10,000 advance. So if the book does well, you might make more than $10,000 over time. There's more information and will be more information on our website. Information about the contest, information about how to write a proposal, the widget for submitting these materials on our website, which is www.arc.press. That's all from me. I look forward to hearing from you, and good luck. Yeah. Okay, so that's interesting. So this gets to where I wanted to go. So you've gone off into areas with conflicts and advised governments on with respect to conflict. So you must have been in some very interesting conference rooms and checkpoints and observation stations. What's the scariest person that you ever met?
I mean, scariest person, there's been a lot. So it all, so two of the scariest people who I've met, I was not actually scared of because I got along great with them. So one was a former mentor of mine. I'm former because he passed away last year. And his name was Jacques Duchemin. Now, Jacques enjoys two nicknames: the Butcher of Monono and the Butcher of the Lobi.
Wow. Okay.
But I didn't know that, obviously, when I first met him and then went to work for him as a war correspondent in the Balkans. But
didn't Jacques find you on a train reading a book that he thought was interesting?
Yes. So the whole story about, and this sort of led into my very quick finding myself into fairly senior engagement at a policy level, all occurred by accident. I was a master's student in France. I had a Fulbright scholarship and was studying conflict and European integration over in Strasbourg. And I was heading to Paris for a friend's wedding. I was standing at the entrance to the train, waving goodbye to my girlfriend, having in my hand a book from the 1880s on the Paris Commune of 1871. And this was before the bullet trains were introduced in between Strasbourg and Paris, so it was a slow 4-hour train ride. And there was a guy who got in the train all the way back in Vienna, so really long train ride. He was in the restaurant car and heading back to a seat in the first class car, saw the book and started asking me questions about it because he spotted old historical book. And it turns out this individual was Jacques Duchemin. Now, what became quite apparent during the train ride is that Jacques was a veteran war correspondent. He had covered, after doing his national service as a paratrooper in the French military during the Algerian War, he covered the Vietnam War, the 1973 Arab-Israeli War, various conflicts in Africa, the Lebanese Civil War. So he'd been sort of a veteran war correspondent who'd been all over.
This is at least the public facing.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, this was the public facing. I learned more later.
Yeah.
But
This sounds like a Le Carre novel. Like I'm expecting you. I don't know this name. I'm expecting to hear. Well, it turns out that he was also working for French military intelligence and was a colonel in the Foreign Legion or whatever.
So basically, he did formerly work for French intelligence. And for the rest of his life, he had what was termed the designation of honorable correspondent, which is somebody who is no longer officially part of the intelligence organization, but who receives useful tips from them and provides useful information to them. But it turned out that Jacques held ministerial level posts in 4 African governments, and as a result was one of the founders of the modern mercenary profession. So Jock was Secretary of State for War in the renegade Congolese province's government of Katanga, and that was a government that was supported by the French and the Belgians in the early 1960s. And Katanga, with French and Belgian support, hired a lot of Western mercenaries, including some of the most famous mercenaries of the Cold War, Bob Denard, Mad Mike Hoare, others as well.
I think this is
Jock
also the
was,
Bob
background.
Denard is the guy who took over the Comoros Islands a couple of times,
yeah,
right?
So super interesting. Not to trivialize this, I think this is also the background of the song "Roland the Headless Thompson Gunner" by Warren Zevon.
I have not.
And-
I've not heard that song. I will have to check
Yeah,
that out.
yeah.
These were the if you have watched the film on Netflix on the siege of um Jadoberg, uh Irish war film, these were the bad guys in it.
Yeah,
Uh
interesting.
and then Jock also later on ended up as the minister, and this was one of the craziest titles in human history, the Minister of Information and Counterintelligence to the Emperor John Bedell Bokassa I of the Central African Empire.
Yeah, that's a business card.
Picasso was the emperor that was one of the two famous African dictators who probably practiced cannibalism and was later ousted from his post after machine gunning school children who didn't want to wear his wife's school uniforms.
Wow.
Yeah, an
So
interesting guy.
yeah, so Duhamel's role in is basically as the minister of, as under these titles. Basically, he went out and recruited forces to fight for these guys, recruited, organized, trained. Is that sort of how I should be thinking about this?
Yes, and provided advice on how to repress domestic opposition and finesse
Yeah.
his foreign relations. So, yeah, and he had a very storied, I mean, he was arrested in the Seychelles at one point for plotting a coup d'etat. Um, so, I mean, he was really a character out of a John le Carré or Graham Greene type of novel.
Yeah. Wow, crazy. So how did you? So he sees you, he picks you out on the train, sits down, starts talking to you. How do you end up with an ongoing relationship with this guy?
By the
By the
end
way,
of the train,
side note, everybody should read interesting books. It opens doors.
Carry books around with you on the train. Yeah.
yeah, this would be a good time to put a plug or a link to what you think are the best books to appeal to your audience.
Yeah.
Um, but so by the end of the train trip, so Jock was born in 1932, and I guess this was the year 2000, so he was 68. So he
Mhm.
was starting to get a bit up there.
Mhm.
Um, so he wanted to go to the Balkans to do a retrospective on the wars in Bosnia and wanted to have an assistant who could do more of the legwork and the stuff that um, he didn't feel like doing. So by the end of the train trip, he basically asked me, would I like to spend my next summer working as his assistant in the Balkans?
Wow.
And, my response was yes, obviously. Yeah,
Sure. You're a grad student. You're looking for things in your summer to build up a resume. Did you know who he was at that point? How much did you know about him?
I knew he was a veteran war correspondent. I knew he was well connected. I did not know of any of the mercenary spy
Right.
uh,
The
arrested for
massacres,
plotting
things that
coups,
he was named for butchering.
The machine gun school children.
yeah, working for a guy who machine gunned school children.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
I did not know any of that stuff. So, I knew I was going to be going to the Balkans with an adventurous war correspondent. I did not know of any of the other stuff.
Yeah. Wow. Did you
And I
kind
thought,
of find it out over time, or at some point did some guy, did the CIA say, listen, we need you to spy on your boss. Here's why. Or
No, I mean, it just can't, we spent the entire, I mean, we spent the entire summer together in 2001, and he was not, I guess, I guess he held off on some of those things because um he was afraid I wouldn't go work for him in the Balkans. But when he had sort of me as he had me as a captive audience, and then also there were weird things that were happening as side bits. So I got abandoned in Vienna for a few days. Wasn't bad. It was Vienna, a
you're,
great city.
you're grown
Uh,
up.
but because he was going to go doing a sort of conflict diamond deal with
Yep. Which you didn't need to be part of.
which I didn't need to be part of, but he introduced me to a good friend of his son who happened to be the great great grandson of Franz Ferdinand.
Okay.
So I was sort of just like left with unstructured time in Vienna, hanging out with um, this Habsburg prince, who's a couple years younger than me. Like, yeah, so there was a surreal quality, and stuff just happened to come out over time.
Yeah.
Um, and throughout the summer, I gradually learned more and more about Jock's past roles
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
those and the sort of less savory bits of it.
Yeah. It's at some point, did you sort of take a bottle of scotch back to your room and think, man, there is a non-zero chance that someone's going to come along to even a score, and I'm just going to like get shot in a foreign country because of the guy I'm hanging out with?
Um,
That's how I would write it. That's my point. If I'm writing you in this summer, there is an evening when you do this.
Perhaps one of the reasons I ended up in so many adventures is I did not
Yeah.
have a good enough imagination to think of all of the awful stuff that could happen to me. Uh, so yeah, I guess from my perspective, having studied conflict, having had parents who, having basically grown up with a, a certain understanding of it, but having never gotten anywhere close to it myself,
Hmm.
it felt reassuring to be with somebody
Hmm.
who, and to be sort of shown the ropes, um, including some of the less formal stuff from somebody who had experienced so many conflicts, ultimately in different roles.
Yeah,
Um, so
that's interesting.
I think you did have that moment, but it was when you were in a lot deeper. It's like when you were
yes,
in Bangui, and there was Captain Paul Baril was there, and you were wondering, who does he work for? Does he work for like a rival French intelligence network? And
yes,
that's when you started like recruiting me to learn French so I can come watch your back.
yeah, I had that experience. Well, that was not so much. I guess I always trusted Jock to help me to the extent that he could.
Hmm.
But I also, probably about a year, what John's referencing was a trip to Bangui when I actually formally became President Patisse's national security advisor, but where I discovered that Jock had Jock was willing to let me get in deep to the point of being in quite imminent danger, without necessarily letting me know to that extent. I mean, soon it was in the Central African Republic, I guess, beginning in 2001, that I discovered that Jock was also willing to perhaps embellish things about me in order to um, get more influence himself. So I ended
Yeah.
up in the awkward experience of meeting with Gaddafi's personal chief of staff, uh, with 24 hours notice.
Who believes things about your resume that were not true?
I still don't know the basis of so I guess to rewind,
Yes.
shall I go into the how we transition between how we
I
transition
love this is what I'm excited about, man. This is fascinating. I love it.
it's sort of this random walk through international relations of the time period. So Jock and I, we spent a lot of the summer in Bosnia basically doing a retrospective
Mm.
on the war in Bosnia. War broke out in Macedonia, the last of the Balkan Wars, at least knock on wood for the moment. And Jock immediately said, Mark, there's a live war going on. We've got to go cover it. So we immediately drove from Bosnia to Macedonia to cover the insurgency there. On the road, one of the incidents that I would describe as one of the things that had me the most afraid, I was arrested by Serbian paramilitaries who decided to make jokes about shooting me. That happened on the road between the two. But this Balkan experience led ultimately to becoming an advisor to the president of the Central African Republic. And the way that happened was September 11th. So September, yeah, I come back to Boston following this summer in the Balkans.
Yeah.
I go in to meet with a member of my PhD dissertation committee, Barry Posen, morning of September 11th, 2001, to sort of touch base on what I need to do for, what I need to think about in terms of preparing for an academic career. And he's like, Mark, let's go out into the lounge. The world's blowing up. Went out into our lounge at MIT Security Studies program. Our military fellows, who are all sort of Navy captain, Army colonel rank, were just sitting there, just transfixed, and everybody was just transfixed by the images on the television.
Yeah.
A couple weeks later, I got a call from Jock asking, Mark, would you like to come to the Central African Republic? So it turns out President Patasei, who was in contact with Jock because they knew each other back from the time when Jock was working for Bokassa in the 1970s, when Patasei was first Bokassa's prime minister and then became an opposition politician when Bokassa went completely insane and decided to recreate Napoleon's coronation for himself. Literally, he spent more than the country's annual budget doing an exact recreation of Napoleon's coronation.
Why think small?
If you ever want to put it into YouTube, I mean, they sourced the uniforms from the Paris Opera because they wanted to have like Napoleonic uniforms for his guards and stuff. But they knew each other from back then, and Patasei asked Jock, do you know anybody who can advise me on U.S. foreign policy?
Mm-hmm.
And the thing is Jock will never say no in a circumstance like that.
Sure.
And Jock used to have important American contacts. He knew Pierre Salinger, Kennedy's press secretary. He used to know Nixon relatively well. But we hit 2001, and he doesn't have any active American contacts. So he says, just with a lot of self-confidence, I can bring over Mark Devore.
Like you're a big cheese.
Like I'm a big chief. I've at this point completed my first year as a PhD student at MIT, and myself and 3 other PhD students, including John, are sharing this little flat, paying too much and eating shitty food, living in the greater Boston area.
Yeah.
But Jock sold me as though I was like, I don't know, some love child of Condoleezza Rice and Henry Kissinger.
Wow.
So, but I don't know this. Jock
Right.
just tells me that, he told the president that, I'm very knowledgeable and suggested that he invite me. So I just told John, yeah, of course, I'm quite interested. I'd never been to Africa before. Um, Happy to go meet President Patterson. I also knew almost nothing about the Central African Republic. Um, like 48 hours later, I get a call at 3 in the morning. Struggle out of bed, pick up the phone, have no idea who's calling me at 3 in the morning. And I just get this heavily accented French voice of like, can you hold on? I'm connecting you with the president. And I'm like, um, and then I get this other heavily accented French voice of like, hello, Mark, my friend. Jock has told me so much about you. When can you come over? And the first thing that pops into my mind is like Thanksgiving vacation. So I find myself, and so I find myself in this surreal experience going from this impoverished life as a grad student in Boston to being flown first class. I think first time I've ever flown first class. Um, from Boston to Paris and then from Paris to Bangui. As soon as I arrive in Bangui, I'm given a suite in the presidential palace.
Wow.
And I have put at my disposition this Mercedes with a license plate of PR for Présidence de la République, which meant that all the other cars had to like pull over and get on the side of the road if they saw the license plate. Um, so it's this absolutely surreal experience. Now, as soon as I learned I was meeting with the president, um, John and I had some ideas related to the immediate post September 11th circumstances. The Sudan, which neighbors the Central African Republic, was one of the only two countries that had overtly supported Al Qaeda and bin Laden. The
That
US
had both been
was,
hit. Afghanistan and Sudan had both been hit the last time there was an Al Qaeda attack on the United States.
and the US was trying to put pressure on Sudan to hand over all of the Al Qaeda suspects who were resident there. But given how close some individuals in the Sudanese leadership were to Al Qaeda, it was far from certain that this would come to anything, at which point the US having a relationship to the Central African Republic could have been strategically important. Now, John and I were able to think this up. I had absolutely no contacts in Washington, D.C., so it was through John and through his father that we were able to get an entree with a Democratic
Congressman.
congressman who was
Yeah.
part of the Blue Dog Coalition, so who was getting along well with both sides and had the had the ear of the Foreign Affairs Commission as well as having the ear of the administration. So so I sort of went there with an understanding that there was certain stuff I could do that might be beneficial. I was in no ways going in an official capacity, but I was going with some contacts and some cover that at least people within the system knew what I was doing.
Knew you were there.
Which is useful because the US had closed the embassy because it was considered to be too dangerous of a country. But then that all got thrown for a monkey wrench got thrown into that spanner when all of a sudden Tuesday rolls around. I'd arrived on a Sunday and the president announces to me, Mark, my good friend, the revolutionary guide of Libya, is sending over his chief of staff with his personal translator in his jet tomorrow to meet with you.
And so you're like 28 or something at this point?
No, I'm like,
We'd be like 25, 24.
I was at that point 25, I think. So I
Yeah.
was 26 when I became national security advisor a year later. So I was 25.
Wow.
I was a 25-year-old graduate student who all of a sudden finds myself, yeah, talking to African presidents and then negotiating with the Libyans.
Wow. Wow. How fun. Um, so this maybe gets, but I want to hear, I think I heard you say you were going to tell us about the two scariest guys, and I think we've only heard about Jacques so far. So I want to get back to that. But this is interesting because it sort of gets into the question of like, all right, you're going and talking to these governments, and of course now you've got a couple decades of professional experience, right? So um, what are you talking about? I mean, are you helping them plan deterrence to avoid conflicts? Are you helping them negotiate? What do you do?
Well, I guess that's always very situationally dependent. So with President Patasei, the Central African Republic was on a downwards trajectory.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so basically, the problem he faced is the country
Coups and
had,
mutinies.
yeah, so the country had a military dictatorship between 1983 and 1993, led by a general, Andre Kolingba, who came from a small ethnic group, the Yakima people, who are approximately 2% of the Central African Republic's population.
Yeah.
But in order to remain in power, he packed the military with members of his ethnic group.
Mm-hmm.
So by the time he was forced to accept democratic elections, 48% of the officer corps and 52% of enlisted soldiers were from his ethnic group that's 2% of the population.
Wow. Yeah.
Uh, and then you have the added problem that one of the things that led him to lose power was the military become too large and the state's finances were in deep trouble. So he could not afford to pay the civil servants and the military. And then President Patasei inherits that. So President Patasei is elected democratically in 1993, and he inherits a military that is both loyal to the old guy, but also that he doesn't have enough money to pay. And this leads to a series of army mutinies that then turn into coups d'etats starting in 1996. And of course, then you end up in a downward spiral of fighting in the country damages the economy further. So a lot of the expats who were important in various sectors of the economy left. Coffee used to be one of the country's biggest export things. The levels of conflict meant that coffee was not making its way to the capital and therefore couldn't be exported. So conflict led to a reduction in revenue, which led to even further inability to deal with the country's security problems, which led to even more conflict.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the situation when I arrived. There had been an attempted coup by the military in order to try to put the former dictator back in power a few months before I arrived.
So Patasei had been the democratically elected leader for 8 years at that point. Am I hearing that right? With maybe some interruptions because of military actions?
Well, he was so yes, he was he was the democratically elected leader throughout. Now, the Central African Republic's constitution was basically a carbon copy of the French Fifth Republic's constitution, which set out the presidential term as 7 years with a possibility of being reelected once. And and then you get hit by term limits. So a president who's reelected could at that time do 14 years.
Yeah. Okay.
So he'd been reelected. But, and a year later, one of my conditions for him when he offered me the position of national security advisor was a promise not to in any way try to seek a third term. Because in a lot of African states, and this has been one of the problems with authoritarian backsliding, is a lot of the African states have had term limits in the Constitution, but presidents have worked hard to try to find ways of overturning those.
Yep.
So yeah, so we were relatively shortly into his second term.
Yeah.
At that point. So, and I guess during the Cold War, the French had a military base in the Central African Republic, which also meant that in exchange for that, they provided some security assistance to the Central African Republic. But as France downsized its role in Africa, they left that base. So in some ways, what I was trying to do was try to advise him on how can he find other sources of security assistance and how could he reorganize his armed forces in a way that would be sustainable and capable of both protecting the country from outside and internal threats while also not being a threat to the government itself. So how do you both prevent coups and uphold the country's sovereignty on a smaller budget?
Yeah. And at this point, do you have your PhD? Are you like ABD or something? You're in the
No,
process?
not even that. I mean, so when I become full-scale national security advisor, at that point I'm ABD.
Yeah.
But this first this first week of going over there and meeting with the president every day and negotiating with Gaddafi's guys,
Yeah.
that was all just as like a relatively junior graduate student. This was, in the first half of the second year of the PhD. So I'm still, so I basically have to, I have courses the week before I go. I have to come back to courses the week afterwards and write up papers and stuff. So it's a little bit absurd to just go from this sort of, I'm a student one week to, I'm meeting with the president and the defense minister and all that stuff, and there's armed guys in the street, and then there's fucking Gaddafi.
So then you went back to Boston.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, I went back to Boston afterwards.
Oh yeah. And like you had all these stories, and everybody else in your program is like, wow, I'm gonna go start riding the trains around Germany and try to find my way into this situation. Because you must have been unique.
No, they all thought he was nuts.
Yeah, I mean,
like our good friends.
One professor thought that, warned me that, is this real or is this like some Nigerian con scheme?
That's funny.
But I mean, I guess it ended up, so I guess one thing is I was expecting to just go for a week, give some advice, and then come back, and that will have been a fun experience.
Yeah.
But the problem came there's two problems that came. One was the Libyans. So meeting with the Libyans. So Angelix Patisse had a call with Gaddafi on that Tuesday. Angelix Patisse told Gaddafi, guess who's in Bangui? Gaddafi said, I don't know. Who's in Bangui? Angelix Patisse said, Mark Devore from the United States is in Bangui. Now, I'm a nobody. And also the internet is not 25. What it is now. So they probably researched me and found nothing. But the fact that Patisse was talking about me as though I'm some high-level American emissary.
Yeah.
And at this point, this is also shortly after September 11th, when the Bush administration is talking about going after various supporters of terrorism. So the Gaddafi regime is sort of crapping its pants at this. So the Gaddafi administration is both afraid that it might end up in the terrorist basket and therefore get attacked.
Yeah.
They're also seeing an opportunity to normalize with the United States because they fought their own insurgency against an Al-Qaeda affiliate, and Libya provided the second largest number of Al-Qaeda recruits. So they actually have a very hostile relationship with Al-Qaeda. So they're both seeing fear and opportunity. And but they have no contact with the Americans because the US and Libya cut diplomatic relations such a long time ago. So they just saw this like Patsy saying that like Mark Devore is here from the United States. They saw this as some golden opportunity, and they sent Bashir Salah Bashir, who was Gaddafi, who's basically Gaddafi's equivalent of the White House chief of staff, there the next day to meet with me.
Wow. So there's no, their internet's really early days, probably, in Tripoli, they're not like really big users of the internet anyway. They're thinking maybe this guy is like CIA, or he's got some kind of Bush administration connection. Who knows?
I have no idea exactly what they thought. At this point, because my Washington, D.C. contacts through John knew about me talking to Patsy, but I felt like I was getting in way over my head with the Libyans. So I was trying to disabuse them as quickly as possible of any thought that I had any influence. But
if you're the Libyans and here's this guy saying, no, 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 I'm not CIA, I'm not connected, I'm just a lowly graduate student. They're like, oh,
right.
Yeah. So that's exactly how it happened.
You're not CIA.
President Patsy has the Libyans come. There's three of them. There's Bashir Salah Bashir, the sort of high-level envoy. There's Gaddafi's personal translator, who was a really brilliant guy, had a PhD in like Hellenistic architecture and knew something like 8 different languages. And then there was the ambassador. So they show up in one Mercedes. I show up in the sort of lender Mercedes from the presidential palace with the PR license plate.
Yeah.
Patsy has both of us come in, where he like introduces like, here's my Libyan brothers, here's my good friend Mark. I think this is a historic meeting. Go off and do it. And then none of this, and then the meeting is scheduled to happen in the like apartment suite they lent me in the presidential palace. So they see that I have this like apartment suite in the presidential palace, and they've heard whatever they've heard. And then I immediately try to say, I'm just a lowly graduate student. I've just finished my first year at MIT. I really like President Patsy, and it's a great pleasure to meet you. I have no official role. And then they act as though they haven't heard that at all. They basically launch into lecturing me about they were not behind the Lockerbie bombing in the 1980s. And that therefore they were very sad when the United States bombed them. But they did not want to escalate that further. And as a state, they could do so much more damage than Al-Qaeda could as a non-state actor. But that let's put the past behind us and let's collaborate, because we have the same enemy now in Al-Qaeda, and the Libyan intelligence agencies have been keeping track of these guys. And here, as a good faith offering, here's a list of 4 individuals who Libyan intelligence have identified as Al-Qaeda operatives in the West.
Holy cow.
Please give this to your superiors in Washington to let them know about our good faith. And, by the way, we'd like a secret meeting with either Colin Powell, Condoleezza Rice, or Jeb Bush. And it's like, didn't you hear the entire bit that I'm just a graduate student who finished my first year?
So fantastic. So you're calling this blue dog Democrat and like, look, I'm not trying to get involved, but this happened.
Well, so okay, we'll get into that in a second. So
okay.
So this was the first thing. Then I'm like, And then the second thing is had to say all sorts of advice as to how he could reach out to the United States. And this was the stuff that I discussed with the Blue Dog Democrat, or not, that John had discussed on my behalf with the Blue Dog Democrat.
Right.
Um,
Jim Turner was his name.
and
Anyway.
then, but I was just expecting that Patsy would ask his ambassador in Washington to take this stuff up with the US government.
Mm-hmm. Is that not how
There
it
was
happened?
there was a problem with that assumption, and that problem was that Patsy ambassador in Washington was a political enemy of his, who he gave the position of ambassador to Washington to get him as far away from the Central African Republic as possible. So he didn't trust the ambassador with like a sensitive mission. So instead, as I'm sitting in the lounge waiting for my flight to leave, a guy from the presidency's office shows up with letters from President Patsy to George Bush and Condoleezza Rice, like making the offer of the former French military bases and cooperation against Sudan if that's necessary for the war on terror, and all sorts of stuff like that. I'm like, how can I deliver these? And he said, the president has faith in you. So so then I end up flying back to Boston with these two sets of things, the set of things from the Central Africans and the set of things from the Libyans, that all should be delivered to the US government, except for I'm a nobody who has no contacts. So so at that point, I turned to John. So the Libyan or the Al Qaeda stuff at least was, I guess in my own mind, I considered it so secretive I didn't tell anybody about it.
Yeah, because you've got the four names of people who are in the U.S. or they're on U.S. military bases or something like that.
Abroad. They're either in the U.S. or Europe, or they're not.
Right.
They're not in Afghanistan or Sudan.
But they're
somewhere in
publicly
the West.
believed to be Americans or American allies or something. Yeah.
I have no idea.
Yeah.
I have no idea who they were. I have no idea whether they were foreign nationals living abroad. I have no idea whether they're really Al Qaeda or whether the Libyans put some domestic opponent of theirs in the list, hoping that the U.S. would crack down on them. For me, it's just four names who they said are Al Qaeda people who our intelligence agencies have identified. Hand this as a good faith offering, and it's very sensitive. So I'm curious today in terms of who were they and what happened to them.
Yeah. Have you ever Googled the name? Do you remember the name? I'm not going to ask you, but like, do you remember the names?
I do not remember the names because I kept it I do have them written down somewhere in a notebook that is somewhere in the stuff I had in Boston that is now in a box in my parents' house in California.
I think I've read
So
enough.
I have it somewhere, but
I think I read enough John le Carré novels to know that you should have those names in the custody of a lawyer in a safe deposit box. So if anything happens to you, they'll be published on the internet or something like that. Wow.
So yeah, then I end up back in Boston, and then the giant question is, how do I actually get a meeting to deliver this stuff? And that almost becomes an interesting sort of sociological experiment, because we're junior PhD students at an institution that's quite well plugged into policymaking circles, but academics tend to have siloed contacts and somewhat oversized egos. So I got an introduction to somebody who makes an appearance in Charlie Wilson's War and was a fellow at Harvard and a former head of the CIA's South Asian divisions. he just sort of brushes it off, and he's like, France controls Francophone Africa, and and I didn't think I could mention the Libyan stuff to anybody. So I'm only talking about the so I'm trying to get a Washington D.C. meeting based on the Central African Republic stuff.
Yeah.
Um, and so I get blown off by this former CIA guy. Talk to a very senior academic at MIT who is very well connected in
The administration.
the administration, the National Security Council, when it came to China affairs. And he's basically like, it's not China, it's not Asia Pacific, I don't care about it. So it ultimately comes to John getting an in-person meeting with Jim Turner and rehearsing everything on note cards about how to make the pitch. And it's ultimately Jim Turner who gets us a meeting with the Africa director at the National Security Council, Jendai Fraser.
Wow.
But it took several months for that to occur.
And so you met
Yeah.
Fraser in person then?
Yep. And John did
Yeah,
too.
we did.
And
Yeah,
what was
we
the
went in
reaction?
and met there.
I mean, were they just kind of, were they astonished? Like these two MIT
Well,
students
she
out of the
actually,
woodwork?
well, she actually had some like MIT connections.
Yeah.
So once we found out who that was, we were able to when we went in, like make some like small talk, and so says hello and yada yada.
Yeah. So she had been before going into, I think she was originally Clinton administration, but she was held over into the Bush administration.
Yeah, that's
Uh,
right.
she had been a professor over at the Kennedy School at Harvard, and therefore, the Harvard sort of MIT, Greater Boston area academic linkages. It actually turns out that she was fairly friendly with some of the professors, just not any of the ones that we thought of going to ask.
That's so wild. Like there's a whole conversation to have here. I mean, this is a detour, but like, man, wouldn't you want it if you were choosing how to structure the government? Wouldn't you want it to be easy for that information to get in?
Yes.
Like, I don't know
Yes.
what it's like now. Maybe there's a whistleblower email you would send or something, but like
You tweet it to Elon.
that's probably right. It's this could be a story, right? This could be a novel. This could be a movie. And you'd have to have a climax, and then the jets made it in time because the guys got through to the National Security Council or whatever, right? But wow. And sorry, this is all out of the Thanksgiving weekend. Is that right? So like then subsequently you get appointed, you get a job.
Yeah. So yeah, all this came out of that week, that sort of 10 days I spent over there, including the 2 weekends, in 2001. And then a year later, I get invited back, for the following Thanksgiving. Now, at that point, things have degenerated further.
Yeah.
And that's when I'm officially asked to be the country's national security advisor. Now, there have been several months where President Patasei had suggested that he wanted to name me into this position. But there was also a frightening presence that in the meantime, he had hired this notorious French mercenary, Captain Paul Burial, who was formerly head of France's counterterrorism squad, but got fired from that for falsifying evidence. And then
If
he
you
ended
get
up
fired from the French counterterrorism team for being dirty, by the way, you're pretty dirty.
You're probably really dirty. So he's there on the
and
ground.
he's a serious customer. He was one of the guys that like broke the the Grand Mosque hostage crisis in '79.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so he's an extremely serious customer. And he also, it popped up at some point as an advisor to doing sort of dirty work for both the president of Rwanda and for the president of Ivory Coast. So he's sort of this Where's Waldo of bad stuff happening in Africa.
Now, by the
But
way, from Patuse's point of view, you've proven yourself, because last year, right, you got through, and like things happened.
yeah, and ultimately,
you're a 26-year-old ABD from MIT, but you got the meeting.
Yes. Yeah, so here's the absurd thing, because we got the meeting, we're able to hand over everything. Both he and the Libyans come away convinced that I actually had this influence that I always claimed not to have. I mean, the Libyans later, when they officially normalized relations with the United States, they invited me to the ceremony. I didn't attend and the Libyan internal report on the normalization of relations between Libya and the United States said that the beginning of the process was the Bashir Devore meetings in Bangui in September of 2001. And it would have been extremely awkward, because from the American perspective, they didn't know those meetings. Yeah, I mean, those.
You're nobody.
And I wasn't working for the U.S. government, let alone any sort of official or unofficial envoy. I was a grad student who gets invited by an African president and then is told the next day that I'm meeting with the Libyans. And the first thing that comes to mind is like the Back to the Future line of like, Marty, it's Marty!
That's funny. But imagine like what they're telling each other. You're going to meet Devore. He's going to tell you that he's nobody and has no authority. Just ignore that. It's pretty sure he's CIA, or he's got connections with the Bushies, or right? Like they're saying something.
And then, yeah, and then it becomes this like self-licking ice cream cone, because so ultimately Sudan played ball with the United States. So there was no need for this military alliance with the Central African Republic, and the US didn't need the bases in Bangui and Bouar. But the US got so many base offers from a number of African countries that created some commission. Since Patisse mentioned me personally in the letter to Condoleezza Rice mentioned me also in the letter back to Patisse. And so she wrote this like really nice letter basically saying thank you, but no thank you. Thank you, but we put your base offer into our interagency commission that will examine it. But we are grateful to you and to Mark Devore for helping us in this time of need, and stuff like that, which just convinced Patisse that everything I was saying about just being a graduate student and not having contacts was obviously a lie.
Obviously false.
Like, we never saw Condoleezza.
Right.
We're never in the same hallway.
Right.
It's Condoleezza Rice.
Fantastic.
Then as the country further spiraled down, he offered me the position of national security advisor. I was told by Jock initially that I should under no circumstances accept this position if Paul Burial, or go to the country if Paul Burial was there, because I was told that Paul Burial was a double agent working for the French and would certainly assassinate me. I was told by Jock before I went back to the Central African Republic in November of 2002 that Paul Burial had been fired and was no longer had a role.
Yeah, and that was not true.
And then I found Paul Burial on the same flight as myself.
Oh man.
Along with this other guy who I couldn't initially. So like Paul Burial's a pretty short guy. And then there was this like giant guy next to him. I'm like, who's he? I've seen him somewhere. He was one of the most photographed mercenaries working for Bob Denard, taking over the Comoros Islands in 1995. So like, so Paul Burial with this other notorious mercenary
Yeah.
are just on the same flight as me.
Wow. Did he recognize you? Or you don't know, maybe?
I mean, I have no idea, but I the next few days plunged me into new levels of paranoia. Um, to the point where by the end of the trip, I thought that like Burial was just going to kill me.
Yeah.
So I get into the country. I'm expected to be taken to the presidential palace again and put up there in that suite. But I'm told that it was damaged in the last fighting, so they're putting me up in a hotel. Luxury hotel. It was one of
Sure.
Angie's best. Um, but the disadvantage of being in a hotel as opposed to the presidential palace is I'm not guarded 24/7 by the presidential guard drawn from the president's ethnic group and therefore like all quite loyal to him. But rather, I'm in a hotel with hotel security, which is not great if you are afraid of being offed by a notorious mercenary.
So do you have bodyguards, or are you carrying a gun or anything?
Yes, I had a bodyguard. I mean, I had a driver and I had a bodyguard, and they were both distant relations to the president.
Uh-huh.
But I was never, so I had the bodyguard when I was out and about in the city, but
Yeah.
not when I was just by myself at the hotel.
Hmm.
And
Mhm.
also, I mean, I'm not Rambo, but I have spent enough time observing military units to think that my guy was sort of handling his Kalashnikov like an amateur and was not inspiring confidence of like, holding it the way I saw US Marines holding their
Right.
um, M4s when I've observed them at maneuvers or handling their stuff like the Foreign Legion did when I went and visited them in the south of France. I mean, he looks like he'd been given it and sort of run through a couple of weeks of training and shot a few magazines, but I was actually not that convinced that he could handle that gun better than I could. Uh,
Yikes.
so, um, and then I found Burial showing up to the same places in Bangui as me. So one thing I did during my various trips to the Central African Republic is I bought local art and antiquities, sort of, old masks, uh, spears,
Mhm.
effigies, things like that. So I went over to the artisanal market, um, and Burial with other mercenary whose code name in the Comoros was Sax. I found that out later. Um, both showed up at the same time I was there. There were three white guys because there's not many white people in Bangui at this point because
Yeah.
if that year it was rated as the world's second most dangerous place.
Yep.
Um,
That adds some nice context to this whole episode.
yeah, I mean Bangui's rated as more dangerous than Kabul at this time period. Um,
Wow.
I and yeah, and there's three white people in the artisanal market, myself and our two French mercenaries.
Yeah.
Um, then I have a meeting with President Patasay, and I mentioned the Burial thing, and he said, "Oh no, I never fired Burial. I get along very well with Burial, and so will you. I'd love to arrange the meeting in person, but he's not in Central Africa right now." So at this point, I'm like, Burial was on the same flight as me. He's been showing up to the same places as me, but the president doesn't know he's in the country. And he's the head of the president's elite counterterrorism cell.
Yeah.
So, so yeah, I mean, at this point, I'm just like, so at this point, I call Jock and I'm just like, Jock, what do I do? How, and Jock's like, okay, keep a low profile. Then I'll make some calls and I'll try to sort it.
So you're just blending in naturally, just blending in.
With the large population of 3 white people.
6-foot blonde California dude just blending in Bangui.
Um, so, so yeah, that, I mean, and yeah, until I leave, I am sort of expecting every night that like Burial will, I mean, at some
Yeah.
point, I actually, in at not so in the artisanal market, I start buying like spears and throwing knives and like all those types of
And
things.
that pygmy bow.
Pygmy bow. I
Weapons.
actually ask one of my contacts whether he can get me pygmy poison, because the pygmies were notorious for using highly toxic poisons, which he ultimately, it takes him a couple of days because he has to like go back to the village, get them to whip up traditional poison, and he brings me this thing of apparently highly toxic poison in a shoe polish container to put on my bows and arrows. And
Wow.
so yeah, every night I am barricading the door because I figure I want a few seconds of extra warning, and I'm
Yeah.
sleeping with this like this very primitive arsenal beside me, and just hoping that, and figuring that if they come in to kill me, they will succeed at killing me, but just hoping to like take them with me and get like some um get some wound with some poison, which I hope at this point the pygmies have provided the real stuff as opposed to just like mixing up something with food coloring and telling me it's
Right.
poison, because it's, I mean, how would I know the difference?
Right.
Um, so yeah, and then I go back.
So you're only there for like, he offers you a job, but you're only there for another 10-day period or something.
Well, so I accept the job, and I say, I'll come back, or we'll figure out the modalities, but I'm also figure I'm not going to go back until I know what a solution to the burial problem is.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and uh, and then things get even a bit crazier if that's possible after that. Uh, uh, so so I fly from Bangui to Brussels at this point because my girlfriend at that time is living in Brussels.
Yeah.
And I'm going to have a few days with her before flying back to Boston, um, where I need to tell my PhD committee about this and tell them that I want to take some time out to be national security advisor to the Central African Republic, have to find a solution to the burial problem, and all of this type of stuff. But while I am in um, Brussels, I get this call out of the blue from this guy named Hans. Now, this guy named Hans is a contact and of another former protege of Jock's, who just tells me, Mark, you're in a huge amount of danger. I need to see you face to face before you leave Europe. And like, how does he know any of this stuff? And he starts to quote from me a fax that Patisset had sent regarding me, saying that I was going to be given the position of national security advisor without any limits or qualifications on it. So I'm like, how does Hans, who at this point is in France, have a fax that was sent between the Central African presidential palace and another destination?
Yeah. And you don't know Hans. Hans is just
I've met Hans before.
okay.
So I've met Hans through Jock before, but I don't.
So he's just
But
another guy in this kind of demi-monde, as they would say, right? This he's kicking around among mercenaries and journalists and national security people.
yeah, I mean, Hans had previously advised both the president of Congo Brazzaville, so the Republic of the Congo, not the Democratic Republic of the Congo, as well as one of the warlords in Congo Brazzaville. Later on, Hans ended up running the Venezuelan branch of a private military company started by two former heads of France's Foreign Intelligence Service. So yeah, Hans is another sort of figure floating around in this demi-monde.
Yeah.
But not one. Hmm?
A little bit spooky.
Yeah.
A little bit spooky. And very
Yeah.
spooky when he tells me that
Yeah.
I'm in mortal
You're
danger.
in danger. Yeah.
Quotes me from a document that he should not have received and tells me he needs to meet with me the next day. Which also makes me wonder since Hans is French and Beryl is French, and if Beryl was a double agent for the French trying to engineer Patisset's overthrow, then is Hans part of that? And therefore, am I actually in danger from Hans?
Yeah.
So
Dun,
I
dun,
meet him
dun.
and by the way, I have no training in any of this stuff.
Right.
So I sort of feel like I'm just catapulted into the deep end of
Yeah.
the weirdest bits of international relations.
You've been taking classes on like the history of guerrilla warfare and, the ideology of Maoism and 20th century nuclear strategy and whatever.
Yeah. So it's all that stuff, but like the nearest I came to knowing how to use weapons was like being in the Boy Scouts and
Yep.
and having done karate in high school. So yeah, so yeah, I'm great at quoting Mao Zedong, but in terms of being able to stand up against these sort of veteran dogs of war, I don't.
Yeah.
I certainly felt out of my depth.
Yeah. Some guy who might knife you and dump you in the Seine or something.
Um, so yeah, then I I arrange a very public part of the airport.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I show up well before Hans does and stake out a table with my backs to the wall so I can see who's in back. So there's nobody in back of me and I can see and track everybody who arrives.
Mm-hmm.
I have one of these weird Central African throwing knives, just like handle available in my backpack in case things go south suddenly. And I'm just, because I have no idea what to expect.
Yeah.
And yeah, and yeah, then Hans, this is 2002, so there's still ashtrays in some of the
Uh-huh.
restaurants in Parisian airports,
Yeah.
and he takes up the ashtray and he points to the center and it says, "Here's you." And he says, like, "You're safe for the moment, but let's imagine that every one of the sides of the ashtray is death. Any direction you move is moving towards death."
Wow.
And yeah, then he offered, along with another mercenary friend of his, to perhaps help with the burial problem. Um, and ultimately, though, in some future round of fighting, Beryl broke a bone and had to and evacuated, so actually exited the equation. Um, but only later did I find out that Jock had sort of resolved the issue.
Uh-huh. Was that by sort of diplomacy with Beryl? Or
Jock contacted a friend of his in organized crime.
that's what was missing. That's the one thing we didn't have in the story yet, Mark. Okay. All right. It makes total sense to me. Yep.
And his basic pitch to this high-level figure in the European underworld
Yeah.
was that if he can get Beryl to guarantee to not touch a hair on my head, I will introduce him to Patisay, which will be great for him essentially trying to do diamond deals.
Yep. That
Jock
sounds
did not Jock did not ask my permission before volunteering my services,
yep.
and apparently said unorganized crime figure called Burial and sort of said, "Burial, you son of a bitch. I know you can kill Mark, but if you do, I'll have killed the only person you care about, who's your son."
Wow. 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 And you are
So
26
this
years
is this is
MIT student.
this is pretty typical, like second, third year PhD stuff. It's pretty.
Yeah,
And you
that's
do this
the
like it's like major research paper, interventions from organized crime to stop an international mercenary from murdering you, and
yeah,
then you got your first colloquium, and then it's kind of
yeah.
it's all in the sequence.
This is what like the Austin and Dante students. I understand they have similar experiences. It's
Yeah,
like,
it's pretty standard for any institution these days. Yeah, I mean,
yeah,
yeah.
holy cow.
I mean,
Uh,
you don't think the money in higher education is for like lab research or something? Uh,
yeah. Wow. Mark, what a fantastic story. This is exactly the kind of stuff I was hoping that you would be able to share. Really, really interesting. Um, I look, I know it's evening where you are, and so I need to let you go and you can do evening things. But uh but let me ask you one. My intention is that this is a short question so that you can give a short answer at it. So if you say this is too long an answer, we'll talk about it another time. But if you if someone asked you, hey, an undergrad student said, "Look, I'd be interested in a career in security studies, right? In international security issues. What's your best advice for somebody who wants to have a career like that?"
um, so I would say you don't you don't need to do the adventures and
Mm,
the type of stuff I did. Um, and in fact, you can probably progress further and faster without it. Yeah, I've done the stuff I have because I mean, I guess two things. One is I felt a sense to actually experience it,
Mhm.
to not just remain at a distance in some ethereal way
Mm.
studying conflict, but to actually see, experience. And I think the other thing was a desire to be useful. I did
Mhm.
not study, if I just wanted to study conflict, I probably would have gone and been a historian like my parents.
Mhm.
But I wanted understanding to actually, and this might sound incredibly naive, but try to mitigate some of the worst impacts of conflict and try to make
Mhm.
the world a safer place. Which, I was wildly idealistic in the Central African Republic, thinking that I could both help the United States in its response to September 11th and also help a struggling democratic regime in Africa stabilize itself.
Yeah.
Um, in the more recent work in Russia, Ukraine, or in terms of advising the British government and other partners and allies related to the Russia-Ukrainian war, or stuff I've done in the meantime in terms of some of the engagement with NATO or the South Koreans. Um, I've been trying to make my knowledge useful for the world's advanced industrial democracies or mature democracies, and help them preserve what is left of a rules-based international order. So you don't have to do all of those things, but I would say if you want to get into security studies, know why you're doing it. What is it about security studies that interests you? Why are you drawn to this? Is it abstract and internet and intellectual? Is it a desire to do good? Are you an adrenaline rushy and an adrenaline junkie, and you want to go and um, work for the UN or CIA or whatever? Name your, anywhere from UNICEF to covert ops and in conflict-prone areas, but know why you're doing it.
Yeah.
Because that will help you make the decisions that will make your experience worthwhile. And then if it's going into think tanks or academia, you want to do a rigorous graduate program. You want to figure out what the key debates are and try to position yourself within that. If you want to go into government or international organizations, then you want to get qualifications relatively quickly, and you probably want to mix in with those some practical and applied experience.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, fantastic.
But
Mark,
I
that's
say
advice.
if you're inclined in this direction, do it. The world is becoming an increasingly unstable place, and we need more people with high quality brains who might otherwise go and work for McKinsey or go and work for a hedge fund.
Yep.
We need you to throw your hat in the ring and get involved in international relations, because if you don't, we might actually end up in World War III, or at least a lot of a much more conflictual and dangerous world that falls short of that.
Yeah.
And don't forget that wherever you go, bring with you some interesting books.
Make sure people can see them on the train. Fantastic. Mark, John, thank you both very much. Those of you who have been listening, this has been, for me, a very interesting episode of the Gopherwood Lounge. Thanks for listening with us, and remember, the humans win in the end.